We've talked a lot about Jewish texts and Hebrew texts, but what about Christian texts and what about English texts? Well, there are several important Christian texts to talk about that I feel like in the history of the Bible would be helpful to be aware of. Probably the first and most important of the Christian texts was produced in the late 4th century by St. Jerome. St. Jerome produced what's known as the Latin Vulgate. The time came when people no longer spoke Greek and they spoke Latin in their everyday usage. So you needed a Latin Bible to be able to service those needs. So St. Jerome translated the New Testament from Greek into Latin. He started translating the Old Testament from the Septuagint from Greek into Latin, but then feared the dangers of double translation because, you know, the Septuagint is already a Hebrew into Greek. If you take it from Hebrew into Greek and from Greek into Latin, he was worried about a game of telephone basically developing with the Hebrew text. So he taught himself Hebrew, moved to Palestine, and actually began translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin. He finished, that text became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's hard to overestimate how significant it is and what a significant translation it is. It's also significant that when Jerome was translating, he did the New Testament from Greek into Latin, he did the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin, and then he came to those deuterocanonicals, those extra books, the Apocrypha that was in the Septuagint. And he wasn't sure he wanted to translate those because no council ever approved them. The Jewish council rejected them, no Christian council ever spoke to them. So since no council had approved him, he didn't feel like he needed to translate them. And he also felt like the level of inspiration wasn't the same in those extra, those deuterocanonicals, the Apocrypha. So he didn't want to do it. But remember, these books have been in the Bible now for 400 years in this Christian Bible. The early Christians were using them. They'd used them for 4 centuries, and public opinion was running very strongly against Jerome, including St. Augustine, and pressured Jerome to finally go ahead and translate them. He did, but he put them at this end of this Bible to, I think, try to convey, look, it's an appendix, but it didn't matter. It came along with the text, and as a result, those books came along in this official Roman Catholic translation when he did it. We don't get an English translation until about the 14th century. John Wickliffe was the first to translate the Bible into English in 1382. It's the first complete Bible into English, but Wickliffe didn't know Hebrew and he didn't know Greek, so he translated the Latin Vulgate into English. So you run those risks of double translation that I spoke of just a second ago. It's stilted, it's a little awkward, very difficult reading in English. But at the time, the Catholic Church was very strongly against having translations in the vernacular because, you know, if common people have the Bible and who haven't been trained in interpretation, hermeneutics, theology, they could come up with some pretty weird ideas. So in an effort to maintain control, yes, but truly motivating it as quality control, they forbid any translations in the vernacular of people. In 1408, Wycliffe's translation was condemned, and they forbid any further English translations. Wickliffe himself was condemned to be burned at the stake. Fortunately, he'd been dead for a couple of decades, so they dug him up and they burned him at the stake. And let me tell you, he didn't go translating the Bible after that. He certainly learned his lesson. One of the weirder parts of history, I know. Perhaps the most significant of the English translations comes in a man by the name of William Tyndale. Tyndale, unlike Wickliffe, was the master of 7 languages, including Hebrew and Greek, and German and Latin and English. Tyndale was able to translate the entire New Testament from Greek into English. He then went to the Torah and did Genesis through Deuteronomy from Hebrew into English. He then went to Jonah. I always thought that was an odd choice for the next book. I kind of get doing the Torah first, but why Jonah? I guess he thought he would knock out the little ones with the easier Hebrew and knock them out pretty quickly. He did a lot of his work in Germany and finished his New Testament in 1525. Unfortunately, in 1536, he was betrayed, tried for heresy, and burned alive at the stake, unlike Wickliffe. So it didn't go quite as well for him. His crime was the heresy of attempting to make the Bible accessible to the average person. I always like to spend a little time on Tyndale just to remind us. I have several English translations sitting on my bookshelf, and it's thanks to individuals who sacrificed, like Tyndale, who thought that was an important thing to do, to have, for each of us to have a copy of the Scripture. Unfortunately for Tyndale, shortly after his death, the Anglican Church said, you know, an English translation might be a good thing. So, boy, weren't they embarrassed. Fortunately, Myles Coverdale another individual who based a lot of his work off of Tyndale, finished the Old Testament and distributed what's known as the Coverdale Bible in 1535. It is the first printed complete English Bible translation that was translated from the original languages. Very, very significant in the history of English Bibles. But I'm betting you've never had a Coverdale Bible, and you've never had a Tyndale Bible, and you've never even had a Wickliffe Bible. But I bet you do know about the authorized version of the Bible, the King James Version. Commissioned by James I of England, he felt the Geneva Bible, another English translation, was a little too Calvinistic and reform in its attitude, and he wanted a little more balanced translation. So he commissioned a total of 54 biblical scholars. So this is a Bible translation by committee instead of individuals. Up to now we were talking about individuals like Jerome and Wickliffe and Tyndale and Coverdale. Now we get a group of individuals together working on a translation. It was published in 1611, but it actually took almost 40 years to gain acceptance. It was, people don't like change too much. I always thought that was interesting. It's the most popular, best-selling Bible translation ever, but it took a long time before people were willing to accept it. When it was first published in 1611, it actually was published with the Apocrypha in it. So there is a King James version with the Apocrypha. That was the most popular. In fact, you could find those up until the 18th century. You can even find some today if you're looking. The King James is one of the most beloved translation, remarkable translation for the time in which it was done. I've always said that to be a good translator, you need to have the soul of a poet. It's one thing to convey the words of the text, another to convey the words and the artistry of the text as well. The King James does that beautifully. Of course, it was using manuscripts now that we have found better manuscripts for, so some of it's outdated, some of the wording is outdated, many of the words don't mean the same thing they did now. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about translation. But it is one of the best-selling, it is the best-selling Bible ever, no small part because now it's in the public domain, and so it's completely free for any publisher to take and change and publish, and then it's 100% profit. You didn't have to pay a translation committee. An important translation, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about translation time.